My own story with Stephen King began as a child. I think I read my first Stephen King story at 15 in the back of the van on a long car ride, and I just read it in one sitting. It was the Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. That's a wonderful, wonderful story. Since then, I've read, I was looking today, I counted on the Wikipedia, Stephen King's Wikipedia page. He's written 66 things, and I think I've read 30 of them. He's a great example of the horror genre. Horror, when taken as a whole, as a genre, probably 90% of it you could take or leave. The other 10% is something, I think it is something significant on the level of real art is being created in the best of the genre of horror. And I think Stephen King lies in the top of that 10%. I think he is one of the best. He's called the master of horror. So tonight, I want to look at the best example of the genre. Like I said, we'll talk about some things that may be unsettling. It might be new territory for us as we stretch. If you're a Christian person here in this room, you might be more familiar in a Christian kind of context, hearing more about the light than the dark. So we're going to talk about the dark tonight, and even the light that's in the dark, not despite the dark, but because of the dark. So that's where we're going. Christians have been deeply ambivalent about Stephen King. And there's a wide variety of reactions to him. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. There's things that I've read in his novels or seen in movies that have been made from his stories that I wish that I could just take out of my head and turn back time and not have in my mind and my memory anymore. Despite that, I want to look at his work because though it has a lot of objectionable content, like I said, it's the best of the genre. And I think there's also a lot of wisdom and goodness and truth and beauty. And as a Christian person, I want part of my development and part of the process of maturing as a human being and a creator and a person who interacts with the creations of others to be an increasing ability to deal with works of art, even if they're troubling, even if they're difficult. So if you're more in the, this is kind of new territory for you, just embrace tonight as a new adventure. That would be my encouragement. I first came across the idea that bringing a Christian perspective to even difficult art is something that Christians should be able to do to a better and better degree in the writing of Francis Schaeffer. He wrote a book called The God Who Is There, and wrote this: "There's nothing more ugly than a Christian orthodoxy without understanding and without compassion. Dare we feel superior when we see their tortured expressions in their art? Christians should stop laughing and take such men seriously. Then we shall have the right again to speak to our generation. These men are dying while they yet live, but where is our compassion for them?" So he poses that question. Dare we feel superior when we see their tortured expressions in their art? That's an apt question for the topic tonight. King's tortured expression is all over his art. And the phrase dying while he yet lives is a good way to describe the first half of his working life. So before we talk about Stephen King, I want to zoom way out and help us ease our way into the topic of horror in general. So I'm going to start with 5 points of critique of the horror genre, and then we're going to flip the coin over and look at a couple redemptive points about horror. So starting with the critique. Horror often has a lot of gore, graphic violence, and objectionable content. Of all the genres, it is in a sense known for that. There's so much to find problematic in contemporary horror. You have the blatant sadism of so-called torture porn. You can think of the films of Eli Roth. Recurrent occult themes, gratuitous blood and gore, and the tendency to dwell on the dark and on evil. And sadly, I think some of horror's popularity is tied to this stuff and the enjoyment of it and the titillation from it. Stephen King wrote a nonfiction series of reflections about horror called Danse Macabre. And he writes in that book, when horror fails, it often falls into painful absurdity or squalid porno violence. There are films which skate right up to the border where art ceases to exist and exploitation begins. So just to be clear, though in a minute I'm going to point out some of the good things about horror, at no point will I be saying that enjoyment of these things for themselves is anything but wrong. We should, however, learn to think carefully about whether what is enjoyed in horror is the gore and the blood and objectionable stuff itself, or whether, often, in the best examples of the genre, those elements are the setting for a larger story that rises above them. We should be able to go interact with that story. So that's the first critique. Second critique, sentimentality as an effective commodity. I think horror commodifies sentimentality. Let me unpack that statement. We're used to associating the word sentimentality with kind of touchy-feely, happy sentiments, warm fuzzies. But sentimentality in our culture is much more than that, and it's something that is everywhere. You can't turn on the TV, you can't open up Instagram or TikTok without getting a blast of sentimentality. So it's kind of this insidious thing that is in us and is affecting us, but we just kind of think of it as that's what happens. That's what Disney's trying to do. So a more comprehensive understanding of sentimentality might be something like turning emotions into effective commodities. So effective in that case refers to the world of feeling, our affect, and a commodity referring to something that can be bought and sold and gathered and dispensed and imbibed at will. So sentimentality in this case is a step away from genuine, real feelings and a step toward simulated feelings that are less real. Open up TikTok. That is why it feels so good to just scroll and scroll and scroll. You get these blasts of feelings. But however, anytime we're stepping away from reality, we should ask why and to what end. As a culture, I think we're desensitized in some ways as no other culture has been. So you see that culture, a desensitized culture, being drawn toward a medium that commodifies fear. And if desensitization brings a kind of its cousin to a felt deadness, commodification that is of something as powerful as fear can bring feelings of life even though you're seeing something soaked in death in some cases. It's to feel that rush is to feel alive. Number 3, often horror is just bad art. Horror, like any genre, has no shortage of examples of just bad art. Films with low production value designed to produce scares or disgust or just disturb you, especially a lot of things that come out around this time of year. So every discipline or media will have its spectrum of great to shabby. So there's a catch here in the criticism that sometimes today's bad art is tomorrow's masterpiece. So I'm not saying that you can't tell bad from good from great. I'm not saying that that's not possible, when you see it, when you interact with it. But I'm saying that when we approach art from another human being, another image bearer of God, we should check ourselves when we're making easy judgments. It might actually be a work of high creativity and originality that we're just not ready to handle yet. Or perhaps it's tripping one of our sensitivities. We have to shut it away and condemn it. However, fans of horror have to admit that often those who produce it aren't out to make art, they're out to make money. As Stephen King, again quoting from Danse Macabre, says, "Let's face it, horror is often the turf of quick buck con artists." So here's another critique, number 4. We are affected by the things we see and read. And this is a reason why many people just stay clear of the genre as a whole. And that's not a bad reason. We aren't and vulnerable to the things that happen to us, or the things that we see, or the things that we read, or the things that we think, but rather the opposite is true. These things can leave an imprint on us, for better or for worse. So in recent decades, the science of psychology has shown us a great deal about how trauma works. Negative things can shape us in negative ways. And those negative traumas can be highly subjective. So something that leaves a negative imprint on me, another person can just shrug off. It's no big deal. Whereas that changed my life. And anytime I'm reminded of that event, it brings all that stuff back up. It can be highly subjective. Let's do a test. Can you think of, just for a moment, don't say anything, just think of something you saw in early childhood that kind of rattled you, that has stuck with you over the years. Maybe a movie, something that was scary, stuck with you, just couldn't get it out of your head. How many just thought of something that was something scary marketed to children? How many just thought of Bambi's mother dying? As I was preparing this lecture, I watched that scene, and it is full of the tropes of horror. Like they're running together, and then the camera follows Bambi, and you start asking yourself, well, where's Bambi's mother gone? And he kind of stops, and you hear things, and it's just all using the horror tricks. Stephen King lists Bambi as the first horror movie he ever saw. So thinking about this, we might do well to remember and to adapt a bit a quote from Nietzsche. Beware that when watching monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you. So just because you can watch something doesn't mean you should. And it doesn't mean that it would be good for you if you did. Last critique, exposure to the demonic. Not a critique that everyone who watches a horror film would have, but certainly one that Christians have, many Christians. Reality is more open to the supernatural realm than we modern people like to think. If the Bible is a guide to reality, then it describes a universe that has two parts, the visible and the invisible. And just as there are good and evil entities in the visible realm, there are good and evil entities in the invisible realm. Most paths between the realms are unmarked. The Lord, in his wisdom, has saw fit to describe two parts of reality in the Bible, but it's not a manual to unlocking the invisible realm, the supernatural. However, we can know that if the Bible is a true guide to reality, that he rules both realms. And we can also know that supernatural evil is a real thing. Going back to Schaeffer, he used to hold up his hand and say the supernatural is here, and he'd liken the visible side of reality to the front of his hand, which you can see, and the invisible side to the back of his hand, which you can't see, but it's there. I can see it. The Apostle Peter says the devil prowls about like a roaring lion looking for something to devour. So it seems reasonable to me to believe that seeking those personalities of supernatural evil increases the likeliness that you will find them or be found by them. So some people, I'm kind of trying to tell the story of this perspective, that horror exposes us to the demonic, in the terms that those who hold that critique might use. So some people would argue that when you interact with horror, you are exposing yourself to the demonic. One equals the other. I have some questions about that idea, in particular what kind of horror we're talking about, and where specifically that connection is made in the Bible. Like what's that logical chain? But I think overall the caution is merited. The Bible couldn't give stronger warnings about seeking out the demonic, while also giving absolute comfort about who rules creation and by whose power we are kept safe. So I'm just laying out a critique of horror. The lecture doesn't end here. The next part is going to be, despite all that, why might we come to this genre, this troubling genre, and is there anything we can even enjoy in it? We can like it. Can we be made richer and wiser through our interaction with this genre. Okay, a couple points here. Point number one, horror often uses distortions to show reality. Horror, and really all genres, ask questions that we need help asking with sufficient imaginative strength for the answers to make a difference. Not every important answer makes a difference to us in the way that it should. So often genre writers will imagine fake worlds and then use that as a way to hide the truth inside it so that it pierces us in the way that it should. So counterintuitively, it's the distortions that can help us see the real world in a truer light. The word for this tradition in literature is grotesque, which applies, it just means something that's outsized or exaggerated or distorted for literary effect. So if there are any fans of Flannery O'Connor out there, she's known for her treatment of the grotesque. All the characters, the settings, the plots, they're all unrealistic in a sense. In the sense that they're absurd and unlikely and silly things happen in them, but they're realistic in the sense that she's using them to make a clear comment on what is, on the state of things. And that's why so many people over the years have come to her writing, despite how bizarre some of her stories are, to make contact with real reality. Let's quote Stephen King again. "The novelist is God's liar, and if he does his job well, keeps his head and his courage, he can sometimes find the truth that lives in the center of the lie." So he says elsewhere in that same volume I'm quoting, "Horror stories do not love death, as some have suggested. They love life. They do not celebrate deformity, but by dwelling on deformity, they sing of health and energy. By showing us the miseries of the damned, they help us rediscover the smaller but never petty joys of our own lives. They are the barbers, leeches of the psyche, drawing not bad blood but anxiety, at least for a while." But with difficult genres like horror, it is a difficult genre, we have to understand the rules of the exaggeration in order to understand the realities it's pointing toward. So King is suggesting that one rule of horror is that of inversion. So to say something about the good, it has to inflate the bad. To say something about life, it pitches characters into a struggle with often death personified, sometimes in the form of a monster. To say something about courage, it has to tell a scary story. So another one of the things that I think horror is uniquely positioned to do almost better than any other genre is to depict the reality of the fall. Brian Godawa said, "Horror can be redemptive by reinforcing the doctrine of man's sinful nature," which is a beautiful and terrible doctrine that doesn't get a lot of play, but it's so important. If we miss that piece, we fall into so many errors. So I think that one of the reasons that horror is the popularity is on the rise in our culture is that we live in a moment of a lot of, we live in a culture where moral relativism is, the name of the game, I suppose. And so in this, horror can be seen as a pressure release valve. So if on a certain level, our culture is telling a story of good and bad that is not as stark as those realities are in your average horror story, people living in that culture might experience a kind of reality attuning going into, or reading Harry Potter, where no one cheers for Voldemort because he's so terrible and awful. Good and bad are so starkly put in contrast. Mike Duran wrote a wonderful book called Christianity and Horror. Don't read it in public. It's got a weird cover with some dripping blood off the H. I was making this lecture, reading it in a grocery store, and people kept looking over at me. So Mike Duran says, "The popularity of the horror genre may be a collective subconscious affirmation that the world is not the way it's supposed to be. It's impossible to confuse who the good guys are and the bad guys are in a horror film." Let's move on. Next point, next redemptive aspect of horror falls under the category of societal and psychological tensions. So horror not only depicts our fears, but it can actually help us grapple with them. Stephen King said, "The artistic value of horror most frequently offers is its ability to form a liaison between our fantasy fears and our real fears." It can lock them together. When horror is able to wear its various socio-political hats, it often serves as an extraordinarily accurate barometer of those things which trouble the night thoughts of a whole society. I love that sentence. Stephen King's writing is full of sentences, and I thought, wow, I could never write that. The things that trouble the night thoughts of a whole society. So for examples of what he's saying here, you can think about the giant irradiated monsters of the post-World War II era stories, or the evil Russian plots of stories in the Cold War era, early James Bond. Or to take a more modern horror story, George Romero's The Dawn of the Dead, in which survivors of the zombie apocalypse shelter in, of all places, a shopping mall. So critics have viewed that as a critique of consumerism and materialism. So the fear here is that modernity is making us zombies, and it is at the mall of all places that the 20th century temple to consumerism, that a zombified society meets its end by zombies. That's the critique. So as King puts it in The Shining, we sometimes need to create unreal monsters and bogies to stand in for all the things we fear in our real lives. So horror is always commenting on that stuff for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. So how do we begin to approach, if horror has all that stuff in it, how do we begin to approach it to tap into those deeper meanings? Again, Stephen King is a guide. He writes, "Begin by assuming that the horror tale is allegorical by its very nature, that it is symbolic. Assume that it's talking to us like a patient on an analyst's couch about one thing while it means another." So assume that it's talking to us about one thing while it means something else. So when we come to horror, the first assumption we should throw away is that everything here is just face value. It's just monsters and blood, and that's all it means in the good examples of horror. And when we do that, we might find that the monsters aren't really monsters. The monsters are metaphors. And it's the metaphors that are the actual monsters. Those are the things that when we get down to the deeper layer, that's what should be scaring us, not the scary clown on the screen. Last point about, as we think about moving toward an understanding of horror from a Christian perspective, Christianity and horror are very related. It might sound counterintuitive, but horror and Christianity have a lot in common. Horror, it has Bible elements in it, and the Bible has horror elements in it. So there's a bit of an exchange. If you just think about the tropes of horror, Christianity casts a shadow over the entire genre. The symbols, the imagery, the tropes, the boundaries of the horror genre have all been shaped by Christianity. You can't write a horror story without dealing with it in some ways, even if you're rebelling against it. Kind of like how, like Tolkien's legacy casts a shadow over anyone who's writing in fantasy. Mike Duran wrote in Christian Horror, "Christianity has shaped classic horror tropes more than any other worldview or philosophy. You can think, for instance, of references to angels or demons, heaven or hell, the place of Christian iconography, such as crucifixes and rosaries. If you wave a yin-yang at a vampire, nothing happens. You just get killed. If you wave a crucifix at a vampire, its head explodes. You know, there's this trope that gives a pride of place to Christian iconography. And the reverse is also true. Many things we might think of as quintessentially horror can be found in the Bible. Here's a list. Supernatural evil that preys on humanity. It's deeply biblical reality. Horrific beasts described in detail. Fallen angels. Demonic possession. The angel of death. The murder of children. Rape. Mutilation. Supernatural plagues. Harrowing escapes from enemies. Damnation. Hell. As well as individuals who are supernaturally empowered to fight that evil. So if the Bible describes reality, the places where the horror genre and the Bible overlap are also places that can be doorways into reality. All right, introduction over. Let's talk about Stephen King. So for the rest of the lecture, we're going to look at his biography. We're going to look at some major themes in his work. And then we're going to zoom in and do a close reading of one of his longer novels. But first, here's an overview. To date, he's published about 66 novels. It's hard to keep track. He just seems to come out with them multiple times a year. His books have sold more than 350 million copies. More films have been made of his work than any other living author. His books have reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list more than any other living author. He's won countless awards, including the O. Henry Award, the National Book Award, the National Medal of Arts, the Penn Award, and many others. You know, these aren't little. He's not getting awards from, Grandma's podcast. These are like the literature's highest awards this man has received. His short stories have been published in everything from Playboy to The New Yorker. He's best known for his work in the horror genre, but he has written westerns, fantasies, science fiction, thrillers, crime, suspense, mysteries, and several works of nonfiction. Once a woman criticized him for writing such disturbing stories, and she said, "Why can't you write stories like that, Shawshank Redemption?" And he answered, "I did write that," but she didn't believe him. He doesn't always write horror. Most often his work is a mashup of several genres, especially when it comes to his 7-book Keystone series, The Dark Tower. It's in that series is every genre in literature. So in short, Stephen King is a cultural giant. He has an immense megaphone for anything that he wants to say, and the culture listens. So he's up on a pedestal in terms of the even the worthiness of studying him, as we're going to do. So let's talk about his biography. Stephen King grew up with his older brother and his mother. They moved around a lot in his younger years and eventually settled in Maine, where he has lived to this day. And most of his stories are set there as well. His father left the family when King was 2, but left behind a box of his old horror and sci-fi novels, which King found and began to hungrily read. And he was hooked, and he immediately he started to read them, and a relative took him away because of her worries about what H.P. Lovecraft and Ray Bradbury might do to his tender young imagination. If only she knew. He started writing and submitting stories to publications as a child, and he kept all his rejection slips on a nail in his room so he could always see them. He comments on the rejection slips in his autobiography. He says, "When you're still too young to shave, optimism is a perfectly legitimate response to failure. By the time I was 14 and shaving twice a week, whether I needed to or not, the nail on my wall would no longer support the weight of the rejection slips impaled upon it. I replaced the nail with a spike and kept on writing." So you can see, even as a kid, he's already walking the path that he will walk for the rest of his life. And he's interested in horror, he's undaunted by failure, and just produces. King hitchhiked 14 miles to the theater that showed the horror and sci-fi movies every weekend throughout his childhood. As an 8th grader, he adapted the movie The Pit and the Pendulum as a short story and sold copies of the story at school for 25 cents a copy. When word got around that Steve King had a story about a lady buried alive in a wall, they sold like lightning. He writes, this is a long quote, but it's kind of fun, so I'll read it all. "I had $9 and change weighing down my book bag and was walking around in a kind of dream, unable to believe my sudden ascension to previously unsuspected realms of wealth. It all seemed too good to be true." And it was, as it turned out. Word soon spread to the faculty, and by 2 o'clock he was summoned to the principal's office, in which one of his teachers brandished the copy of the story at him, quote, "as if I was a dog who'd piddled on the carpet." And she asked him, "Why would you want to write such trash?" And he remembers the scene in his autobiography. He wrote, "I had no answer to give. I was ashamed. I've spent a good many years since, too many, I think, being ashamed of what I write. I think I was 40 before I realized that almost every writer of fiction and poetry who has ever published a line has been accused by someone of wasting their God-given talent. If you write, or paint, or dance, or sculpt, or sing, someone will eventually try to make you feel lousy about it." He was forced to return all the money, But as soon as summer vacation came around, he self-published another story called The Invasion of the Star Creatures, which the other kids flocked to buy again. It was his first bestseller, he says. He married his wife Tabitha in 1971. He met her as a student at the University of Maine. They had 2 kids by the time they'd been married for 3 years, and King was working 2 jobs as a high school teacher and as a worker at an industrial laundry. The money from short stories sold to magazines went to groceries and diapers and kid medicine, and they could barely make ends meet. In 1973, he had an idea for what might be a novel-length story about a girl with psychic powers who's being persecuted by her classmates. He sat down to write it and only made it about 3 pages in, and then threw it away. His wife found the crumpled pages in the trash can, picked them up, read them, gave them back to him, and said, "You've got something here." The story became his first published novel, called Carrie. He sent the manuscript off to a publisher and, quote, "pretty much forgot about it and got on with my life." It was accepted by the publisher, and they got a little cash advance, which they spent on a new transmission for their car. Months passed, and Carrie inched toward publication until one day the phone rang. It was King's agent, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And King responded, "Do I need to?" And the agent told him that the paperback rights to Carrie had sold for just under $400,000, half of which went to King. After the phone call, he wanted to get something special for Tabby, but the fanciest thing you could find at the local drugstore was a hairdryer. So he bought the hairdryer and then came home, gave it to her, and told her that their money worries were over. In his autobiography, which is called On Writing, a memoir of the craft, and is a fantastic book if you're a writer, the next line after the story of Carrie is, "I got drunk for the first time in 1966. He was 18. He got terribly drunk on cheap whiskey on a school trip. He promised the teacher chaperoning he would never do it again, and when the bus stopped at a rest stop, he bought more whiskey and got drunk again." It was the beginning of an alcohol addiction that nearly destroyed him. He wrote, "Alcoholics build defenses like the Dutch build dikes. I spent the first 12 years of my marriage telling myself that I just like to drink. One night he went out into the garage to drop a few more beer cans in the recycling and realized that the bin had been empty just a few nights ago, but was now full to the brim." So here's a long quote from his autobiography about this time. "By 1985, I had added drug addiction to my alcohol problem. Yet I continued to function, as a good many substance abusers do, on a marginally competent level. I was terrified not to. By then I had no idea how to live any other life. Yet part of me, the part of me that writes stories, the deep part that knew I was an alcoholic as early as 1975 when I wrote The Shining, which, as an aside, is about an alcoholic father who tries to kill his family after being snowed into a hotel all winter. So he's saying that part wouldn't accept that. Silence isn't what that part is about. It began to scream for help in the only way it knew how, through my fiction and through my monsters. In late 1985, I wrote Misery, the title quite aptly describing my state of mind, in which a writer is held prisoner and tortured by a psychotic nurse. In 1986, I wrote The Tommyknockers, often working until midnight, with my heart running at 130 beats a minute and cotton swabs stuck up my nose to stem the coke-induced bleeding. Tommyknockers is a science fiction tale in which a writer discovers an alien spacecraft buried in the ground. The crew is still on board. It's not dead, but it's only hibernating. These alien creatures get into your head, and what you get is energy and superhuman intelligence, but what you give up is your soul. It was the best metaphor for drugs and alcohol my tired, overstressed mind could come up with." So he was once asked about this time in an interview in Rolling Stone. And the interviewer asked, "Did you ride on cocaine?" And King said, "Oh yeah, I had to. I mean, coke was different from booze. Booze I could wait. I didn't drink or anything, but I used coke all the time." The interviewer asked, "You had 3 kids. It must have been very stressful to keep this huge secret while balancing all your other responsibilities." And King's response was just, "I don't remember." Back to the interviewer, "I'm trying to comprehend how you lived this whole secret life of a drug addict for 8 years, all the while churning out bestsellers and being a family man." King responds, "Well, I can't comprehend it now either, but you just do what you have to do. And when you're an addict, you have to use. So you just try to balance things out as best you can." but little by little, the family life started to show cracks. I was pretty good about it, and I was able to get up, make the kids breakfast, get them off to school, and I was strong. I had a lot of energy. I would have killed myself otherwise, but the book started to show it after a while. Misery is a book about cocaine. Annie Wilkes is cocaine. She was my number one fan. In this time, his family sits him down for an intervention. One night, his wife Tabby gathered a group of family and friends over to their house and began dumping trash bags full of stuff from his office out onto the rug. Beer cans and cigarette butts and cocaine and pills and empty bottles of NyQuil, empty bottles of mouthwash. His family told him that he was dying in front of them. Tabby said he could either get help or get out of the house. As he says in his autobiography, it was thinking about his novels as distress calls from his soul that tipped him over into the edge, into quitting. He decided that he'd trade it all in order to stay married and have a chance to watch his kids grow up. And perhaps this is what he's thinking of when he wrote the dedication to his novel, It, which says, "My wife and my mother taught me how to be a man. My children taught me how to be free." My wife and my mother taught me how to be a man. My children taught me how to be free. So he's confronted by his family. He's at a tipping point in his life. And he realizes, if I'm going to have this, I can either choose the drugs or the family. So if I'm going to have a chance to grow up with my kids, he's got to change. Let's talk about Stephen King and Christianity. King has been open about his religious views. Of his childhood religion, he wrote, "My view is that organized religion is a very dangerous tool that's misused by a lot of people. I grew up in a Methodist church, and we went to services every Sunday and we did Bible school in the summer. We didn't have a choice. We just did it. But even as a kid, I had doubts." And King has since departed from organized religion as an adult. Yet he made it clear that he still believes in God. This is going back to the interview in Rolling Stone. King said, "I choose to believe in God because it makes things better. You have a meditation point, a source of strength. I don't ask myself, well, does God exist or does God not exist? I choose to believe that God exists, and therefore I can say, God, I can't do this by myself. Help me not to take a drink today. Help me not to take a drug today. And that works fine for me." In another interview, he said, "I'm not a proselytizer, and I hate organized religion. I think it's one of the roots of real evil in the world. If you really unmask Satan, you'll probably find that he's wearing a turnaround collar. But I've always tried to contrast the bright white light of real goodness against evil." In his novel, It, King wrote, "If life teaches anything at all, it teaches there are so many happy endings that a man who believes there's no God needs his rationality called into serious question." So that's in the narration at the end of it. So you see this duality in his approach to religion. He's drawn to it and repelled to it. He has doubts, but also it's a topic that in all his work, it kind of slowly orbits. And his writing shows that duality too. Religious characters are just as likely to be heroes as they are villains. His novels show a sophisticated grasp of theology and religious sensitivities. And his writing is soaked in religious themes, often overtly Christian themes. And characters are strangely empowered by a connection to something very like the Christian God when they're facing down the forces of evil. For instance, Father Callahan from Salem's Lot is a fallen priest in a sense. He has a confrontation. Salem's Lot is like Dracula in New England. Father Callahan has a confrontation with a vampire in which the vampire tests his faith, and Father Callahan finds that he doesn't believe like he thought he did. Years later, Callahan appears again in the Dark Tower series. It's sort of like all of major characters from King's previous writing make little appearances in the Dark Tower series. One of the fun things about it. So Callahan is a character in this later book. And it's much later in his life, and he's regained his faith. And in a pivotal scene, he's once again facing a band of vampires, and he drives them back with his faith in God, which radiates from his body like a white light. Here's another example. One of the kids from It, named Mike. So in the novel It, Mike faces down this evil clown, and he's armed like David and Goliath with only rocks that he's picking up from the ground. and he's panicking. He's just throwing rocks at it, and they just bounce off him, and it's coming closer. And then he screams, "God, help me!" And he calls out to God, and he feels himself strangely energized by a power beyond himself. And the next rock he throws damages it so badly that he drives the monster off. So there's these little moments where something else peeks through. Okay, so we're at a turning point in the lecture. We're speeding to a close. I considered wrapping it up here, but I didn't want to end without looking at more in depth at one of his more popular works. But the question rises, which one? He's written 66 novels, a bunch of short stories. Shawshank Redemption comes to mind. It's popular, it's beautiful. As the title indicates, it's filled with redemptive and Christian themes. The Green Mile, that would have been a crowd pleaser and pretty easy. The main character is an innocent on death row with the initials JC, not an accident. His death gives new life to the other characters. But as the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous says, and the preface to Dr. Sleep, at the turning point, half measures availed us nothing. So I'm going to do a harder book, 1,200-page novel that some, including myself, consider his best and scariest and most awful and most disturbing. The novel is named after its antagonist, a creature so scary that it's most often referred to by pronoun only. I'm, of course, talking about it. So we're going to look at it. It has had enduring popularity since its publication, sold millions of copies. In 2017 and 2019, the story was remade into 2 films. As soon as the first one came out, it shot straight to the #1 spot in the highest grossing horror films of all time. And that's not a list that's easily topped. It's not like every Halloween you get a new one up there. In 1963, The Exorcist was, 1973, that took the #1 spot. And it stayed there for over 26 years until The Sixth Sense displaced it as #1 in 1999. Also, both of those movies, full of Christian themes. The Exorcist literally being the story of a battle between the devil and 2 priests for the soul of a child. Then It Part 1 came out in 2017 and went straight to the top. So the question is why? What is it about this story? Also, it's still #1, Part 1, and Part 2 is #5. Why? What is it about this story that draws people? It's not just, it's scary. Frankly, it's not the scariest film I've seen. There's lots of films that are way more scary. I would suggest that it's the deeper things that the story is communicating beneath the horror things. So we're going to look at it in the next 10 minutes. Here's a quick plot synopsis before we go on. So in it, a supernatural monster lives beneath Derry, Maine. Every 27 years, it wakes up and eats kids. This is where I probably should have chosen the Green Mile. It eats their fear and appears to them, and their bodies. And it appears to them as the thing they fear most. So it's kind of interacting with their fear. 7 outcast kids have run-ins with the monster, and they individually have these experiences, and they're drawn together by how this monster's terrorizing them. And they think they kill it as kids, find out that they don't, and they have to return as adults 27 years later when it wakes up again and summons them back to Derry for a final confrontation. Disclaimer. This book contains a lot of disturbing scenes, and it has a disturbing premise, and I definitely don't recommend it to everyone, especially young people, especially if you have sensitivities. You will live a fine life without ever reading it. Go for it. And there's some scenes in it that I think for sure should have been cut. The world would be better without that scene. However, by its very difficulty, it can be a good grindstone to hone ourselves against, hone our ability to approach difficult work and do it with sensibility and see deeper themes in it. So that's what we're going to do. Before we jump in, remember King's advice about how to interpret horror. Begin by assuming the horror tale is allegorical by its very nature. It's symbolic. Assume it's talking to us, like a patient on an analyst's couch about one thing while it means another. So when we look below the surface of the tale, we'll be looking for the true meanings, the big ideas that the story points toward. What are some of those big ideas in it? One of them is for sure the nature of sin and evil. Lots of things have gone wrong in Derry. It's not just the monster. It's a place haunted by evil, both everyday evil and the supernatural kind. To use Christian language, Derry is a place where the fall itself is intensified. Good people go wrong, bad people get worse. Everyone turns a blind eye to all the evil they see around them. And I think there's warrant to speak of the problems afflicting Derry in Christian terms because they bear a strange resemblance to the Christian story. Derry is under a curse. Like the Bible, the curse has impersonal effects. It even affects the material world of Derry and effects that are personal, natural and supernatural. However, it's energized by the personal manifestation of that evil, which is a creature that calls itself Pennywise, and it appears most often as a clown. Like the devil of old, Pennywise came down to the earth from heavens in a ball of fire and crashed deep into the earth, and then above that crash site, Derry grows. It's kind of like his feeding pen. Pennywise is a manifestation of evil in the world. And there are parallels between King's use of the monster and the story that the Bible is telling about evil. If you think about Genesis 4, when Cain is considering killing his brother Abel, God says to him, sin is crouching at your door, and it desires to have you. Sin is crouching beneath your town, and it's coming for you. But you must overcome it. So God likens sin to a hungry creature that will get Cain if he lets it, which is basically the plot of it. So how else is sin intensified in Derry? The kids have bad parents. So as I've said, the story centers around these 7 kids, and their parents are not good. They're not only harried by the monster underneath the town, several of them live with monstrous parents at home. And King nods to some of the things he's saying about real life evil when he has one of the kids reflect in a moment of clarity that adults are the real monsters. Another kid says at one point, home is the place where when you go there, you have to finally face the thing in the dark. Because that's what home has been like for these kids. And that's not an exaggeration for some of them, especially Bev, the only girl in the bunch, whose father physically and sexually abuses her. So another thing that King is drawing out about sin, well, I'm saying is present in the story that he made. I don't know if he's intentionally doing that. Is the cyclical dynamics of sin. So the monster wakes up every 27 years. There's a cycle. And King writes in a few details that show that natural, as in non-supernatural, evil also has its own cycles. A few of the kids grow up and marry the monsters of their childhoods. Bev marries a man who abuses her, just like her father did. Eddie grows up and marries a hypochondriac woman who keeps him captive to his fears by preying on them, just like his mom did. So childhood coping mechanisms become adult coping mechanisms if they're not faced. So reflecting on this theme, one writer puts it this way: it is the story of the discovery of the true face of evil, in that it upholds the idea that evil is real, wreaking havoc in ways large and small, and must be opposed. It is perhaps no surprise that an age that has formally renounced good and evil, both at the philosophical level and on the street, can no less escape its reality. And perhaps people are drawn to movies like It for a reminder of the reality that the acceptance of evil is a trap from which we must dream ourselves free. So that's one redemptive cluster of themes in It. Let's look at the other side. The conflict between good and evil is something that really stands out in It. That's what the story is all about. One theme here is the triumph of weakness. Just like the Lord of the Rings and the Bible, the heroes of the story achieve an unlikely victory, not in spite of their weakness, but because of it. The heroes of It are very weak. They're misfits and outcasts. They're not even adults. They're kids. The hope of Derry is 7 kids. This is not a team of Navy SEALs. And each of the 7 protagonists has something that sets them apart, something that sets them, makes them outcasts. The fat kid, the black kid, the Jew, the stutterer, the nerd, the crybaby, the weird poor girl. When they find each other, they give each other the name the Losers Club, because that is the name society has already given them. One writer commented, "To King, the social markers that make the kids outcasts in school, from being nerdy to being overweight to enduring acne, also make them uniquely outfitted to be conduits for readers' social anxieties and fears." So another theme here in the conflict between good and evil in it is the bonds of love. The kids find strength to fight back against the monster in the love that grows between them in the Losers Club. And they even discover that these bonds are worth sacrificing for. As one of the kids realizes, this is a quote from the book, there aren't any such things as good friends or bad friends. Maybe they're just friends. People who stand by you when you're hurt and who help you feel not so lonely. Maybe they're always worth being scared for and hoping for and living for, and maybe worth dying for too, if that's what has to be. No good friends, no bad friends, only people you want and need to be with, people who build their houses in your heart. So as the bonds between the 7 kids grows, the monster discovers to its horror that the more it terrorizes the children, the more they find strength to combat the fear they're feeling in the comfort of one another. So King creates this dynamic in which the monster is, in preying on these kids, is developing them into a force that's strong enough to beat him. It's this kind of judo move. Here's another theme, the power of faith. The power of faith really stands through in it as he wouldn't have been able to achieve if the mechanics of the story were different. If this was a different genre, something would be lost. So through the course of their battle with the monster, the kids discover that Pennywise gains power when they're afraid. That's why it appears to each kid as the thing that kid's most afraid of. And the converse is true also. Love and laughter and self-sacrifice and belief actually hurt and wound it. It can consume them, but only if their fear already consumes them. King, reflecting on his story when the movie came out in 2017, said, "In it, faith makes it possible to battle monsters." Those kids, they're the only ones who are still able to believe in monsters. You have to have faith, and you have to believe that good is going to triumph over evil. So this is the author, years after writing the story, reflecting on the core of what the story is trying to say. So he highlights that thing that he's trying to communicate with an interesting twist on the classic trope of the horror genre, of the protagonists having the scene in which they arm themselves for the last battle. The kids' weapons aren't weapons at all. They are the symbols of their weakness. Their strongest weapons are the symbols of their weakness. So one of the kids weaponizes his inhaler because he believes that it will affect the monster like acid, and it does. The joker of the group uses his laughing powder against it. They melt down a silver bullet in one scene, a silver dollar into a bullet, because they believe that that's just what damages monsters, and it does. So their weapons only become deadly when they're animated by faith that they will be deadly. And the faith is the actual thing that hurts the monster, and the thing that it is actually attacking. But the most powerful scene in the book, I think, that highlights the weakness of the characters and the power of belief and the nature of the evil they're trying to overcome happens near the end of the novel. So there's a little bit of setup needed for this to understand this scene. So some context. Bill Denbrough is the leader of the 7 kids, despite his terrible stutter. He's driven to unravel the mystery of the evil that's plaguing the town because his little brother Georgie was Pennywise's first victim in the cycle that started when Bill was a kid. After Georgie's death, that's how the novel starts. Georgie dies. After Georgie's death, Bill's once happy, normal family changes into something darker. His parents become cold and distant to one another and to Bill. Bill can't seem to rouse them out of it, and he feels that his family's falling apart as his parents turn into monsters of neglect. A dark certainty fills him that all this is happening because of him. After all, he was the one who sent Georgie out that day. And Bill begins to believe that his parents blame him for Georgie's death, and he feels crippled by shame. So, when the kids go down to face the sewer, go down into the sewer to face Pennywise, the monster strikes Bill directly. Not with violence, but with the shame that he's carried with him. It appears in the form of Bill's greatest fear, his dead brother. And with Georgie's voice, tells Bill that it's all his fault. For a few moments, Bill knows that it's true, and the monster draws closer to him. Then Bill, who always stutters, shouts in a clear voice, "George knows I didn't mean for him to die. My parents were wrong. They took it out on me, and that was wrong." And Bill's choice to believe in that truth turns him from the hunted into the hunter, and the monster flees away. So let's pick up the narration here. Bill felt something begin to grow in his chest, something hot and choking and as painful as fiery nettles. He gripped his knees and drew them up to his chin, hoping that it would stop the pain, or perhaps ease it. He was dimly thankful for the dark, glad that the others couldn't see his agony. He heard a sound escape him, a wavering moan. There was a second, a third. Then they were around him, his friends, and someone held him. They were near with him, and for that little while the darkness was kind. Such a powerful scene. So remember that home is the place that when you go back there, you have to face the thing in the dark. So the thing in the dark is not the monster in this case, but what the monster means. The thing in the dark that crept into Bill's home after Georgie's death is grief. So the story, at least Bill's part of the story, is about that. The action is chasing down this monster and trying to figure out how to kill it, but really what's going on underneath the surface is it's a story about processing grief. Bill's actions caused the death of his brother indirectly. And in facing this monster, he faces the grief. George knows I didn't mean for him to die. My parents were wrong. They took it out on me, and that was wrong. So he sets aside this shame. So King's view was that monster stories, remember, are like patients lying on an analyst's couch, telling you about their dreams, where everything appears as one thing but means something else. In it, King uses the tropes of horror to tell a story about grief and loss and families and friendship and trauma and kindness and fear and evil and healing, and above all, the triumph of goodness through faith and hope and love. And there's lots of ways to talk about those things, and all great art finds its way to those topics somehow, as artists are innately drawn to deal with these transcendent aspects of life in the mediums and modes that are available to them. So if we grant that King had available to him the mode of horror, I think we also have to grant that there might be something said here that couldn't have been said in any other way. Something good that's being offered that would not be as good, or would not have been able to be offered if the goodness was not also surrounded by the trappings of evil.